AM 1460, the new WXBR. You were listening to the Metro South Morning Show. Peter Zimbor here with you on this Monday morning. Joining me right now via the telephone is a man who is the director and producer of an upcoming film about the Wrecking Crew, a backing band that basically provided the soundtrack for countless hit singles throughout the decade of the 1960s and beyond for many artists that you may not have even have known that they were the band playing on their actual tracks. Joining us right now to chat about it is the director and producer, Denny Tedesco. Denny, good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning and Happy New Year.
Denny, I kind of butchered what exactly the Wrecking Crew was in the intro. Why don't you put it in your own words? What was the Wrecking Crew? What is the Wrecking Crew?
The Wrecking Crew is a term about a group of musicians in the 60s in Los Angeles. In the early 60s, they were the recording group for so many, like you said, the Beach Boys, Sinatra, Jan and Dean, Mamas and Papas, the Byrds, Elvis. Anybody that was going through L.A., these guys were most likely part of the recording itself. The recording industry at the time, in the early 60s, they didn't trust the rock and roll groups to actually play on the albums because they were young kids, most of them, and they didn't have the recording jobs, so no one wanted to, send someone into a studio and just record forever. So they had studio musicians do the music. And these guys, they would go from recording date to recording date to recording date, and they were the hot ones. And the reason, supposedly, that they became known as the Wrecking Crew years later, they were known that, is because the older guys who were more established in the world of recording said these young guys are going to wreck the business recording this rock and roll. So that's how they got the name, the Wrecking Crew.
So let's talk about the way the music industry was, say, in the early 1960s. There was a lot of bands who maybe played their own instruments and would perform live but didn't on the records,
Sure.
Or were some of these bands just flat out not musicians and they were posing with guitars, basses, and drums on their album covers, but it was actually someone else doing all the work?
Yeah, same people. Same people that did them both. Yeah, well, it's a great example. There's a few examples. Listen, the Beach Boys, at the beginning they were playing their own instruments. They had a recording contract. And then, Brian Wilson started, basically doing his own, well, not doing his thing. He would be writing, and it was easier for the studio musicians to come in and lay down the tracks instead of the guys. So that, like all of Pet Sounds, there's all these guys, a lot of the songs from mid-60s on. It was just easier for the studio musicians. They only had one track, when there was mono. So as Glenn Campbell, who's one of these musicians, said it was like playing with Michael Jordan, but everybody in the room was a Michael Jordan. You had 3 hours to get 3 or 4 songs done, and you had to move and get in and get out because you had another recording session to go to. So, like the Byrds, a perfect example. The Byrds, they're all musicians, but when Terry Melcher, the producer, got the job to do it, Terry said to them, he says, listen, I'm fine. I'll do your first single, but you know what? I need to have my guys in. You could have Roger McGuinn on the actual album. He could sing and he could play guitar. But I need Hal Blaine on drums. I need Leon Russell, who was then a session guy, on piano, and Larry Nexel and a couple others. And the Byrds were very upset about it. Didn't even show up for the recording date. Well, as Roger McGuinn said, he said, listen, we did the A side and the B side of Mr. Tambourine Man, and number one hit, and we did it in 3 hours. He says, but when we did Turn, 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 also number one hit, it took 77 takes. So there is a difference at that time period of musicianship possibly in a lot of these groups. My father was one of these musicians, and that's why I started this documentary in 1996 before he passed on.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. You got involved with this because your father was actually in the band. Tell us what it was like growing up with your father who was in the group and how you became acquainted with what they were all about.
Well, in a weird way, when you said something, he's in the band, none of these guys were like set together. It was not like a set group it was only the group of 5. There was about 20, 30 musicians, and there was so much work in L.A. that everybody was working. So my father, as a guitar player, he was one of maybe 6 to 8 guitar players that were constantly working. Him, Glenn Campbell, Billy Strange, a guy named Bill Pittman. There was so many, there's 2 of them. Then the drummers, there was Hal Blaine and Earl Palmer. Bass players, there was Carol Kay, was a woman bass player. Lyle Rist, Joe Osborne. But they would go to session to session to session. But that was their job. You know, people assume we were having a hoot nanny at home. I didn't see my dad play guitar until the 70s at home because Dad went to work like any other dad. But he never took his instrument out when he came home because he just played 12, 14 hours. And it wasn't the same material all day. He could go from Sinatra to the Beach Boys to the Chipmunks in a day. It was that crazy of variables. I mean, it was like, I always like to say, it was quantity, not always quality that they worked on.
We're chatting with Denny Tedesco of the Wrecking Crew film here on AM 1460, the new WXPR. Is there any point in time where you can point to different songs that the Wrecking Crew played on that were all simultaneously charting at the same time? You've already mentioned some legendary bands, the Beach Boys, the Byrds, Frank Sinatra.
I mean, in the heyday for them, see what happens is when they're starting out, let's just say in the late 50s, early 60s, most of the record business is still in New York or Detroit or Nashville or London. When I say records, rock and roll, top 40. You start slowly seeing the tracks when Bill Spector starts hitting the charts. You also start seeing Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys doing their stuff. And all this stuff is starting to grow and grow in the early 60s. Now things are happening, moving. Everything starts to move west slowly. By 66 and 67, the charts are filled with the West Coast. You have the Mamas and Papas, you have the Fifth Dimension, you have Nancy Sinatra, you have the Beach Boys. You have all of these things charting at the same time. The records of the year from 66 to, for 6 years in a row, Hal Blaine played on them. You know, from Herb Alpert and Tijuana Brass to Simon and Garfunkel to Fifth Dimension a couple times. You know, so those things just kept charting. They were basically, they were charting, one hit after another. It was crazy.
Now you mentioned,
they didn't want to get off that gravy train either.
Now, you mentioned earlier, you used the Beach Boys as an example. They're a band that started off playing their own instruments and playing on their own recordings of their songs, but ultimately, as their songs got a little bit more intricate from a musical standpoint, Brian Wilson wrote the music, the Wrecking Crew performed the music, and the Beach Boys sang on those songs. That's a case where an artist brought them music to play that was already written. Did the Wrecking Crew write their own music as well at other times, or was it they simply just hired hands, they would play what was written for them?
It was all up to, it's all up for grabs. And sometimes, something would, they would lay the charts down. Maybe the leader had an idea about a song, and they would run through it, and then someone would say, well, what do you think about this? And they'd take it a different direction. The other thing that's very different in those days, let's say in those 60s, when they were all in the room, they had to be in the room together. They listened to each other. They played against each other and with each other. Do you know what I mean? They answered to each other. So when something was going in a different direction, maybe they liked it, maybe they didn't, but they had a decision they could make at that moment. Let's do it that way. Mistakes happened. Mistakes became hits. Nowadays, the difference between now and then, a guy could do his wonderful album in his home. Well, maybe he's laying down the drum track, and he's laying down the bass track, maybe he's laying down his, vocals and guitars and everything else. Well, nothing's influencing each other. So that element of surprise or the element of artistic, knowledge of years, it doesn't come out as much now. It's harder to find today. And I'm not saying that there's not great music today. That's the other thing is, the discussion is everyone says, oh, they don't make music like they used to. Well, you know what? Technically, maybe not. I think there's some fine music out there. I think the next Brian Wilson or Lennon and McCartney or Jimmy Webb, they're out there. You just can't find them. There's so much content. How can you figure out what's good and bad?
It's one of those things where the digital age, everyone can put their stuff out there, but maybe it makes the good stuff a little harder to find with the advent of the internet and things like that.
Radio was so important. That's the other thing is how important radio was. They all fed off of each other. Everybody fed off each other. Radio did the top 40. Once radio started realizing, we could do top 40 or whatever, record companies started going, oh, we can make some money maybe. Let's start pushing it. So they start putting out a lot of albums. But they only had, like Jimmy Webb said, when I was living on the farm, he said I only had 3 radio stations to listen to. So on a radio station, I might be listening to Ray Charles and then Sinatra and then Motown and then a country song. That could all be within one, or Percy Faith, it could all be on one station. He says, so our influences were diverse. He said, radio today is very segregated. We only listen to what we want to listen to or have that option of listening to. So that kind of is different now than it was then. But like you said, the internet, I mean, anybody and everybody could put something out there. And, you try hard enough, you could, hopefully the cream will rise to the top.
Now, the Wrecking Crew played on all of these bands' albums and records that we've mentioned, the Beach Boys, the Byrds, Frank Sinatra. I think Sonny Cher is another one that we have not mentioned. Now, were they credited on the albums for performing on them, and were they compensated financially for doing their work, and were the two always one and the same?
Not always one and the same. Always compensated. What was different about these guys were it was a union town, meaning Los Angeles was a very union town, meaning they had infrastructure already built. They had studios, they had the TV, they had film going. So it was pretty organized in terms of labor-wise. So, they did non-union days, they did cash dates or dark dates, as they call them. But most of it was on the legit contract. What that provided them was future revenue years later. Like my mom will still get a check for something. If a song that was used, let's say, in a commercial, she'll get a check today for it.
You're watching 50 First Dates and you're hearing Wouldn't It Be Nice Be Played, and you're just going, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what was great, she got a nice couple checks last month for the comeback special, Elvis. And I looked at these checks, I was confused. I said, Dad didn't work on Hound Dog. I don't know what that's about. And realized it was the comeback special in '68, and it was the music was used for a slot machine or something in Vegas. So that was a sense that, all right, the musicians were compensated for their work for something that wasn't meant to be, which is great. That was fair. Now, whether they got credit or not, that was up to the producers at the time. A lot of times they wouldn't want to give the musicians the credits. The association was a perfect example. They said, no, Bones wanted to use the studio musicians, and the association said, fine. They weren't happy about it. They wanted to do their own album. They recorded, but Bones did it. Bones held the producer. And when he tried to give him credit, the association said, no, we want the kids to think we're playing. Now, same thing with the Beach Boys. You don't want the Beach Boys, the record company, they want to keep that persona going, or that, thing of, yes, they are playing on their albums. Or, it would be if you started seeing the same names over and over again, it would be ridiculous. I mean, Charlie Watts, the drummer from Stones, and then I saw in an interview, he said how disappointed he was when he found out Hal Blaine was one of the 5 of his favorite drummers. Or not for one of the 5 of his favorite drummers. You know what I mean? He was on everything. But that's the way it was. It was a business. As long as he got paid, they were fine.
Yeah, did they even care about getting credit, or was simply pay me and we're good?
I think sometimes they do. I think sometimes they did, because don't forget, some of the stuff, I don't want to say beneath them, but some of the stuff was just playing guitar or playing drums on a silly track. Maybe, my dad did Batman, he did Green Acres, he did Bonanza, and they did all these themes. And he worked with, Beach Boys, and I think you want to be compensated, or not compensated, I think you want to be credited when you really go, yeah, that's me. You know what I mean? Where you're really, where you're really, doing your thing. But yeah, it helps, but no one cared.
Now, at what point did the Wrecking Crew as an entity, I guess we'll say, cease to exist? Because they are seen as a group of people who were a group of studio musicians who did this, and this.
Sure.
At what point were they no more?
I think what happens is the heyday, when I say heyday, is I can only go by contracts. The contracts in '67 was the heyday for them. And you can see it in the charts. Everything's LA-based. Like I said, Fifth Dimension and all these other groups. What happens at this point now they've had their run for a good, 7, 8 years, 9 years. And now we start seeing different things come in. Music's changing. Now you're getting James Taylor and, Carole King and those guys coming in, and they're doing the folk thing. Groups like Zeppelin, they don't need, these are real groups that are just self-sufficient. They don't need these guys. More tracking is coming in. Now we don't have a single track. You could risk bringing the real guitar player of the band and letting him play and then doing it again and again until he gets his solo right. Earl Palmer, the drummer, said by the 70s, they weren't record dates, they were record projects. They could take weeks at a time. He said in the 60s when we were doing something for Liberty Records, he says, we did an album a day for 6 weeks. That's when Liberty started. They would just knock it out. Jackie DeShannon, Jan and Dean, Dickie Carr, you named it, they were knocking it out. But by the 70s, things start changing. My dad went less in the rock and roll records for sure, but went more into TV and film. And then in the 80s, he was doing lots of film. He was fortunate. He was one of the fortunate, musicians because he could read. He was a phenomenal reader and guitar player for that. And he lasted, way into the late 80s. But some others went on the road. Bill Pittman went on the road with Burt Bacharach. Hal went on the road with Janet Dean. Not Janet Dean, I'm so sorry, John Denver. Still doing record dates. He did a lot of record dates in the 70s. But, things are changing.
Are any of these studio musicians from the Wrecking Crew still active?
Don Randy's still active, the piano player. Don has a wonderful club that he's owned for 45 years now called the Baked Potato Jazz Club in L.A. Still plays like every couple of weeks, on Friday. Phenomenal club. With the best musicians in the world over there. And then Hal's not really playing. And Chuck Berghofer, the wonderful bass player, he's still playing. He did the boots were made for walking, that bass, that bass line. Not really, because a lot of them unfortunately have passed on. When I started this film 17 years ago, my dad was diagnosed with cancer. That's why I started it. So it just jumped on him, filming him and his friends. And he passed away in 97, but it's been until today, I've been working on just trying to get it released. I had to pay off over, $500,000 worth of licensing. And we've done it by donations. We're still doing it by donations. So hopefully, for the next couple of weeks, we'll have it together. Hopefully a distributor will finally say, oh, look at this. It's done, then we'll do it ourselves.
Well, let's talk about this. Distribution for this film has been limited at best, chances for people to see it. You've done some interesting things to fundraise in order to hopefully get this distributed and released properly at some point. What exactly have you done? What are you doing right now that people can get involved with?
Sure. Well, basically what we've done is we've had to do, there were 4 budgetary problems. When I say budget, chunks of change that had to be done. We made the film. We did very well. We got into the festival in 2008. This is all on our own. We did very well, great reviews, unbelievable reaction. But it was 2008, so no one would touch this film because there was a heavy cost on the backside, meaning music licensing and stock footage and stuff like that. So over the last few years, what I did, we raised money through the International Documentary Association, which was a 501c3. They were able to take donations on our behalf. They turn around and they send us the money. We turn around and send it to a label or a publisher. So 99% of all the music's paid for. We just did Kickstarter, and we raised the money for the musicians union, which was over $200,000. So that was really great. So we've done it different ways, and we're just knocking it out. We're just keep going at it. Just don't give up. People can still donate. We can still donate, from $5. It doesn't matter. We'll take anything. We have people. We've created different slots in the credit lines. We've been very fortunate. We had Herb Alpert and Jerry Moss both get $50,000 each over the years. So that helped us. But now we're creating we have 10 spots on the back of the credits as special sponsors. And the funny thing is, for $10,000, it's like advertising for them. it's rethinking how you look at a film and how you market it. So like that, we had 3 spots taken already. And you know what? What was really crazy is 2 out of 3 people that took those spots are auto dealerships. You would have thought the record companies or the music companies would have jumped in, but the only music companies jumped in so far was Heil microphones. But it's weird how you have to do it. I mean, this is not the way to make a movie, but you know what? Whatever it takes to get it out.
And if people want to donate to this Kickstarter campaign, where exactly do they go on Kickstarter?
They can go wreckingcrewfilm.com.
wreckingcrewfilm.com, and that will direct them to the Kickstarter campaign.
Well, Kickstarter's finished as of this point, but we're still taking donations that are tax deductible, which we still need. So they can still help us out that way. And there's a merchandise store there as well.
wreckingcrewfilm.com. Denny, I think that this would be perfect for a VH1 or a VH1 Classic or something of that nature, and I wish you the best of luck with this project.
I thank you.
Any final words for our listeners before I let you go this morning?
No, just if you go to the website, you'll be entertained, like just not by the trailer, but there's 90 minutes of outtakes. I got Leon Russell, Glenn Campbell, so many people. There's people that didn't make it in the film. Like in the film, I have Brian Wilson, Herb Alpert, Nancy Sinatra, Cher, but I couldn't put everybody in the film, so I have Jackie DeShannon, Bill Medley, Petula Clark, and a lot of the musicians. I just didn't have enough room to put in. So you're more than welcome to take that out.
Well, that is Denny Tedesco of the Wrecking Crew Film joining us here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. We'll step aside for a quick breather. We'll do local news back after this.